This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Hello, Cardinal fans. Welcome to episode 16 of the St. Louis Cardinals Unrestricted podcast. This is your host, Christian May-Suzuki, and today we're looking at a team in 2021 where Adam Wainwright is the best pitcher on the team. Now, with that, there's some good news and some bad news. The good news is that Adam Wainwright is pitching like the best player on the team. The bad news is Adam Wainwright is pitching like the best player on the team. Now, here's why. It's great that he's pitching well. It really is. It's nice to see that he's really been able to put it together. He's made that contract more than worth it. He's really shown a lot of life at the end of his career. We're not going to remember him as a guy who went out in flames, who faded away and looked like a shell of himself before being forced out of the league. No, we're going to look at Wainwright as someone who left on his own terms and left with grace. And honestly, a few years ago, I was worried that was not going to happen. I was a very large advocate of Wainwright retiring year after his Achilles injury when he put up a pretty rough year. He was putting up some pretty big ERA numbers in the 4s and 5s and 6s, and it wasn't the Wainwright that we were used to, and that's not the Wainwright that we were remembering. But then he comes back and he puts up a 3.15 and a short 2020, and then this year he's at 2.97 ERA. He's picked up a 13-7 record, which doesn't necessarily matter that much. 3 complete games, one of which was a shutout. You really can't ask for much more from a guy who just turned 40 a few days ago. Now, obviously Jack Flaherty is hurt, so that skews things a little bit, but part of the problem is Jack Flaherty is hurt. So where does that really leave the Cardinals? This year, it's probably not the year. I think that we can sort of see that at this point. There's definitely some flashes here and there, and it shows that this team has a great deal of potential, and there's definitely a base there. But at the end of the day, we have to look at the reality that this team isn't quite ready to compete yet, and we're in this position with the best pitcher on our team going into his 41-year-old season next year. It's the last year, obviously, for both him and Yachty. So suddenly the window becomes more clear. Suddenly that J. Happ and Lester trade become far worse because now you really have a concrete window. Okay, this next year is it. We need to prepare to make something happen next year. Obviously, Arenado sort of keeps things up in the air with his contract, and that's a secondary window at this point. But right now, the Cardinals' duty is to focus on competing next year with Wainwright and Yachty on their way out. Obviously, there are a couple of things that could happen that would derail these plans. If both those guys go into a tailspin and they are continuously played, then okay, it might be a little bit more difficult to really compete. And it would just be nice to give them their swan song. With Yachty, I'm starting to think that that's what's going to end up happening. I'm hoping that he plays more of a part-time role and the Cardinals stop mutilating the development of the young catchers that they get as his heir. First, it was Carson Kelly. He was supposed to be a very, very elite catcher prospect, and that just disappeared. And Kninsner is also supposed to be very, very solid, and apparently he's not in the future plans. And then they have Ivan Herrera, who we haven't really seen very much of, and we don't really know how his bat's going to translate over at the end of the day. So what's going on, guys? We have to really figure this out because this is it for Yachty. And at the end of the day, as important as he is to the franchise, as important as he is to the team, and as much as he may have earned the right, you can't allow him to dictate when he does and does not play if it's going to impede with your plans with the future catcher. Because after 2022, it doesn't really matter what Yadier Molina did in the past. It doesn't matter how good he is, how much of a legacy he left behind. He won't be on the team anymore. And the Cardinals are going to have to deal with the reality that they need to play a catcher every night. And they might not have one that is ready to not necessarily fill Yadi's shoes, but even replace him as a starting caliber Major League Baseball catcher. So we have to really figure out what the direction is here. Are we pushing to win next year? Are we going to hold until next year or until 2023 and start a new rebuild, until then biding the time and waiting for Wainwright and Yadi to leave? That's what seems like it's the plan, but that's not necessarily a great plan. I think the fans have sort of demonstrated for the first time in a very long time that they're getting fed up with the product in the field. They're getting fed up with the general apathy that they feel that the management has, in particular with those trades that sort of, it really echoed a position of, we're just trying to get through this season. We're just trying to make it to the end and work our way up next season or however many seasons from now. And that's fine to have. It's okay to accept, it's time to flip your cards. It's time to fold. And with this team, it probably is. But to give up multiple young prospects for guys that won't even benefit you beyond next season, guys who you're essentially folding the moment you draw them, there's no point when you have other cards that you could have played that have the potential to be something. You put Gant in a starter role after he has a sub-2 ERA as a reliever for a while, and you are marveling when he starts struggling after putting up great numbers for a while. And then that's how he falls out of favor. I just feel like that was, in particular, the losing Gant for a guy that has no real potential beyond this season. That was the kicker for me, and that made me question what are the Cardinals trying to do? Are they that desperate to get a starting pitcher? Was there really no other way to get a starting pitcher with a 6 ERA or a 5 ERA without giving up a guy who was incredibly productive for a long time in a role that he was misplaced in? Now, some pundits might argue, well, John Gant wanted to start. He was part of the decision to start. Well, you know who else wanted to start? Carlos Martinez. Should the Cardinals have listened to him? No, they shouldn't have. At the end of the day, they're players, yes, but you have to take a look at the tape, take a look at the numbers, and if everything overwhelmingly points towards that player being a reliever, they're going to be a reliever, or they're going to be off the team, as Carlos Martinez is about to be. He really should have stayed a reliever, and he was pushed into the role out of necessity, and he was pushed back into the starter role out of necessity. And that's unfortunate. But at the end of the day, we have to put guys in the best positions to win and in the best position to succeed. And while people might have their gripes about Carlos Martinez, about sort of the mental game and the way he might have conducted himself in various situations, both on and off the field, at the end of the day, dude was incredibly talented, and you can argue in many cases he was mishandled. And part of that was because the team bent too much to his will and allowed him to dictate whether or not he was a starter, whether or not he was a reliever. And the team's necessity, the roster construction, also sort of dictated that as well. And that's kind of what happened to Gant, which is really unfortunate. It's because he was forced to be a reliever because of the lack of starters as a guy who has demonstrated a high walk rate, especially and a higher pitch count. Excuse me, that's probably a better way to put it. He takes his time with batters. He walks a lot of batters because he takes his time. And he's shown for a long period of time that huge inflated walk rate. And the Cardinals sat there and simply allowed him to keep going until it burst. And when it did, they're suddenly shocked and see the need to bench him and the need to trade him. That right there is just, I mean, that was a problem. And that has been a problem for a decent amount of time. And continuing on with that, the former Cardinals leadoff hitter made some very interesting comments regarding his time as a Cardinal and his time now as a Brewer, and the difference in philosophy and how they allowed him to hit and what they were telling him. Basically, the long story short is that Wong believes that the advice funneled to him and given to him by Cardinals coaches was meant to mold him into a leadoff hitter, because the Cardinals did not, and still do not have a leadoff hitter. And that's not what Wong was. I don't think anyone thought that Wong was a leadoff hitter. He succeeded very, very nicely in the 8th spot. And part of that is because he was sitting in the 8th spot and he was comfortable there. And the situations, the at-bats, and the types of pressure that you face are different in the 8th spot than the 1 spot. And you can't just shift a guy that radically, that quickly, right away. Even if they're on a cruise or on a tear, the difference in the approach, even from the start of the day when you have to approach your day in your game, you are used to being a guy who can see the pitcher, how he's feeling, how he's throwing, get used to the timing a few times going through the lineup. But as a leadoff hitter, you're the first guy up. You got to be the first guy to see it. You might not have time to get adjusted and to feel that. And suddenly that throws off your entire rhythm. Obviously this is hypothetical. This is all just based on, what could possibly happen, and just based on the fact that baseball is a game of rhythm. And this is just the reality of the situation. It's more than just skill that is involved in moving guys around the lineup. It's about fit, it's about feel, and it's about the situations. And Kolten Wong is not a leadoff hitter, and that's just the simple fact of the matter. So the differences that he's shown with the Milwaukee Brewers, he accredits to them essentially allowing him to rewire his swing and do his own thing. So when you compare the numbers, it's honestly kind of interesting. You have his last 3 years as a Cardinal. Just as a general, we're not going to get too deep into this. So he slashed 269, 349, 393. So you obviously see a pretty low slugging percentage there. And his year with the Brewers this year, he's at 284, 347, 463. So there's some interesting things to take note there. So while the average that he had with the Cardinals was significantly lower, 15 points, than the average that he has this year with Milwaukee, his OBP with the Cardinals is actually a lot higher. Or not a lot higher, but it was 2 points higher. The walk rate is clearly a lot higher. And that makes sense. We've seen with the Cardinals' approach, with Albert, and even beyond that with Mabry, where it was just a lot of patience. It's a lot of taking strikes down the middle, a lot of trying to draw walks, and especially with Albert now, it's a lot of the analytical game. And what does the analytical game favor a lot in the hitting category? I'll give you a clue. We all watched Moneyball. That's right, OBP. Everybody loves OBP. And people want to come to say, well, Wong's OBP is similar, almost higher than it was in Milwaukee. And sure. That is absolutely reality. But I think this particular case really goes to show you the limits of OBP and why, at the end of the day, as I always like to profess, walking is great, but hitting the ball is still the number one thing you have to do in baseball. And if you can't hit the ball, I don't care how good you are at drawing walks, you're not going to be able to play. You want a guy who can't hit the ball for anything and can still draw walks? Look at Matt Carpenter. You like Matt Carpenter right now? No? Then that's not what you're looking for, because Matt Carpenter is the guy who can't really hit, who focuses on drawing walks, and clearly he's not a valuable player. Now, Wong might not be drawing walks as often, but that 463 slugging, the fact that he's able to hit the ball, the fact that he's putting it in with power and getting extra bases, and really actually becoming the player that he could have been, it is a pretty poor reflection of the system of the Cardinals and the way that hitting has been approached. Now, this is a very, very deep and complex topic, to be honest, because while the coaches do deserve some criticism, there is a lot of stuff that goes on around the Cardinals that they get blamed for that might be out of their hands. It's tough to say, because you have situations like Colton Wong where they come out and they say that the Cardinals and their coaching negatively have impacted them, and statistically those numbers show up. And you have guys that will end up finding their hitting mojo and their sort of ability to hit again and say that it came from an outside source. There's that side of it. And there's also the other end of it, guys like Nagowski, who clearly improved from the hitting camp, and that was well documented. You have guys like Bader and O'Neill who have really improved, who are able to see the ball much better. There's a lot of interesting things. You also have, and give credit to Matt Graves, the former editor at Redbird Rants, my former coworker. He pointed out that Edman's stance has changed, and it has changed relatively dramatically. There's a couple of big things if you look in April compared to now and see how the stance has slowly sort of morphed into something almost completely different. And it seems like that he's improved. I mean, clearly he's hitting the ball well now, and it seems like he's slowly improved as he's modified that stance. Is that something we can't give Albert credit for? Because it might be something we have to give him credit for at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, the coaches can only work with the talent that is presented in front of them. And we all know that, yes, there is definitely a lot of talent, but there are definitely players who just aren't performing quite right. And unfortunately, as much as I love the guy, one of those dudes is Nolan Arenado. Nolan Arenado, he hasn't put up necessarily poor numbers per se. You know, he look, a 255 average is not great, but he's been hitting the ball with power to an extent, and you know, a above 800 OPS is obviously not the greatest in the world, but it's definitely an above average number, and it's good enough to, maybe not good enough to suffice as the middle of the order hitter that we're looking for, but when you really take a deeper look, not necessarily a deeper look, but when you just look at the home and away splits, you'll really see what's going on here. So on the road is the Nolan Arenado that we were kind of looking for. He hitting 276, 330, and 540. So that's almost a 900 OPS. Hitting the ball with power, has 15 home runs in 250 at-bats. I mean, that is the stuff that we're looking for. In Busch, he's hitting 233, 295, 433, which is basically among the dregs of the Cardinals. That's not good. That's worse than what guys like Carlson and Wong are hitting this year. And that is not the player that we're looking for. So the question is, are we panicking yet? Is it time to worry? Is Nolan Arenado a Coors product? I mean, no, not yet. We obviously have to be concerned because Busch Stadium is definitely a pitcher's park, and it might be a little bit more difficult to be the player that he was in Colorado, sitting in basically the opposite field. But at the end of the day, it's only been, he's only played 63 games at home in Busch. He has been on a team that for a good portion of the season at the beginning, he was the only guy who was hitting the ball with success at any venue. And it might be tempting to hit the panic button and be worried that he can't hit at Busch. But at the end of the day, when it comes to looking at those 64 away games that they've played and how he's done in those, it's not all in Coors Field. There are plenty of other fields that he's playing in, and he's still hitting at a pretty elite level. Not necessarily the level that we're hoping for. Not that 962 OPS, the 300 average, the huge 583, 561, 586, those types of slugging numbers with big 120, 130 RBIs. But he was in Colorado, so we have to temper our expectations a little bit. He still has a pretty decent number, 125 hits. He still has 26 homers. He's not necessarily hitting the ball poorly. He's just adjusting to Busch. And whether or not that occurs next year remains to be seen. And that's when you might start to worry about things. Because assuming that he does lock in for 2022 and beyond and would end up staying until 2027, if he can't hit in Busch, paying him $35 million over 3 years, then 32 in 2025, and then 27 million as a 35-year-old in 2026, will not feel good, even for a guy that is charismatic and as into St. Louis as Arenado is, and as a guy who is as good of a defender as Arenado is. As I've said, at the end of the day, you still got to be able to hit the baseball. And if Arenado is not hitting the baseball and hitting the baseball with power, the way that we need him to as the middle of the lineup batter, there are some issues. Because there's only so much blame that can be placed on John Mozeliak when he constructs a team and he gets guys who are middle of the order guys, and they don't perform at middle of the order production. That forces you to try and force someone else into the middle of the lineup, or in Colton Wong's case, the top of the lineup. And this is where you get your issues. This is where you miss your players, and you hide their talent behind mishandling, and they go to other teams, and you have a situation like, as we're about to get into, Adolis Garcia and Randy Arozarena. When you look at those two guys in particular, those are probably the two prospects that Cardinal fans are most disappointed about losing. I have my own reservations, and I have my own opinions on that. But when you look at Dylan Carlson, who is the guy that they kept over those two, and probably the reason that Adolis Garcia and Arozarena were traded in the first place, you can see a little bit the shortcomings and the reason that people are upset. So it's not the worst in the world, where you have Carlson at 1.6 WAR on Fangraphs, whereas Adolis Garcia is at 3 and Arozarena is at 2.2. So pretty big gaps between them and Carlson. But at the end of the day, when you look at them as players, they all have shortcomings. Jag, his K to walk ratio is awful. He has a sub 300 on base percentage, and he strikes out almost a third of the time. I mean, that's definitely a big hole. And we've seen Arozarena become really, really streaky and is also not necessarily a plus defender. In fact, he's rated as a worse defender than Carlson by Fangraphs. So the question is how do we look at trading these two guys? Personally, I don't really see the problem necessarily now. I get that Arozarena had a postseason, remember, and that he has clearly proven that he is a solid asset. But at the end of the day, there are two realities that we have to face. A, who knows if Arozarena would have become the player that he is today as quickly as he has become with all the things that we've heard about Cardinal coaching, and just generally speaking, you never know what happens in a different situation. So you have that, and then you also have the fact that the Cardinals have a pretty decent outfield. The outfield is not the issue here. You have Harrison Bader, who has now emerged as a pretty decent outfielder and center fielder. And if he continues to hit the ball the way he is, then there's no way that you would play Jagger or Arozarena over them. The way O'Neill is hitting right now, he's turning into a 5, even maybe a 4 hitter. And again, with plus defense, plus speed, you don't pull that out. And if Carlson continues to mold himself the way that he is, you're not really getting that much of an improvement from a guy like Jag replacing him with Carlson, or a guy like Arozarena replacing him with Carlson. There's not that much of a difference or a drop-off there. So that's not necessarily the trade or the prospect given up that I am upset about. Would it be good for the game if Arozarena stayed with the Cardinals and either him or Carlson ended up being a bench bat? Probably not. Would Jag have really shown his power and been able to shine with the probable platoon / whatever issue or whatever would go on with the Cardinals trying to play those guys or keeping Jag or keeping Arozarena over Carlson? That's all such speculation. There's so many hypotheticals that go into that, and there's such little sample size that we have for their careers that it's far too early. And it's not even just far too early. Not only is it far too early to even make a assumption on their careers, as I've said, you can't make those what if predictions because every organization and the way a player grows and cultivates in that organization is different. So you never know. Dylan Carlson could have become a Arozarena and they could have actually won the World Series. You just never know. He could have hit one more home run. You never know. And that's why at the end of the day, they're doing well, and that's great for them. And I'm very happy to see Adolis Garcia and Arozarena play at the level that they are. But we're not talking about this huge gradient where one guy is a fringe starter barely in the league and the other guy is setting the world on fire. No, these are both very young players who are establishing themselves in the league, who are very highly talented and are well received and well looked upon and are succeeding at not exactly the same levels, but at very similar levels in the majors. So let's not get all upset about that. At the end of the day, the problems come with the pitching, the problems come with the middle infield, and the problem is, at the end of the day, going to be replacing the catcher. It's not the outfield. I think the last thing the Cardinals have to worry about right now is the outfield. Now, speaking of the bullpen, this next segment, we're going to look into some changes that might happen in 2022, particularly with the bullpen and Alex Reyes. We've seen that as great as he was at the beginning, he's faltered a lot, and it's had Cardinal fans calling for his head, or not for his head necessarily, but for him to be pulled out of the closer spot in exchange for Gio. Do I agree with that? No, not at all. Not one shred. Look, Alex Reyes has issues with control, and this is a granted problem that we have understood and that we know. And you have to approach the way that you use him as such. Part of the reason that I think that there were so many issues was because guys like Gio and guys like Reyes were being used so often by Mike Schilt and Maddox and whoever you want to say controls that. So overusing these guys, pushing them for more innings than they should, can't. Anyway, these are what lead to these issues. This is what leads to people losing their control and blowing saves or having issues getting guys out and throwing strikes. And that's why the question marks surrounding them can be a little frustrating, because it's not necessarily of their own creation. Now we have to look at the bigger picture here too, because another guy that you have to look at is Jordan Hicks and what his role is going to be in 2022, and then where Gallegos is going to end up being with Hicks back. Are they really going to end up having Hicks as like a 7th inning guy? Could Hudson end up being a bullpen guy and they move someone as a starter? I'm hoping that Hudson becomes a starter, a 5th guy that they can sit back, but bringing him back at the end of the season, they might not want to do that. They might just stick out with the Happ and Lester group. So I think that Alex Reyes should remain the closer. I think we've seen his elite potential, and I think that Jordan Hicks should have to earn that spot back, because at the end of the day, Jordan Hicks has a lot of the same issues that Reyes does. And Gallegos does not have the plus stuff that either of them do. I don't trust him in the closer role one bit, especially in the real crunch time when it comes to getting really good batters out. I just don't see the sharpness there, and I don't see the plus, the real plus that you need to get guys out in the postseason. That is what you see with Reyes, with Hicks, and that's why those two guys should be the top dogs in the bullpen no matter what. You really have to use the tools that you have. These are some incredible tools that you have at your disposal, and you simply cannot allow them to rust away in the tool shed or to be used on medial tasks. It's like pulling out you have two cars. You have a Honda and you have a Tesla, and you're just driving across the street to the Target. And instead of using your regular car, you use your Tesla, and you do that 200 times. And suddenly you just use your Tesla to get to Target 200 times, and it's not working as well anymore. Where when you could have used your regular car with not as great of an engine, and suddenly for that real nice long drive, you have a nice, smooth, new Tesla to use. So it's sort of the same thing, where you have these incredible talents. You have guys who you have brought up as either an ace or as the closer of the future. So to put them back and to relegate them as lesser guys after a few weeks or a few days or however a little bit of struggle or one injury or two, I think is a wrong decision. I think that especially with the age of these guys, you gotta let them grow up, and especially in this year where they're not truly competing and they're not truly caring to win the World Series as demonstrated by the trade deadline. This is when you let a guy like Alex Reyes continue to close and continue to work through his issues. If he really is at the point where he can't pitch and he can't work through his issues, that's a bigger problem entirely. But right now, I think he's got the talent and the ability, and we're really needing him to build the mental strength now to push through a moment later in the season. He's getting tired, and he's starting to struggle. This is where you really build that mental resilience as a closer, and you get back up on that horse, and you show us that you have the balls to get it done in the toughest situations. And I'm hoping that's what we see from Alex Reyes, which is why I believe that he should not be pulled out of past the 8th inning. He should not be in the 7th inning or earlier at any point. He should be an 8th or 9th inning guy. That should be his role, because that's what the Cardinals have slated for him. That's what he's built for. That's what he's drafted for. He's drafted for a premier spot as a future player in the Cardinals, and he has the talent to be that future cornerstone. So use him as such. That's what needs to happen. He needs to be used as such. Another potential cornerstone for this team is Nolan Gorman, and there's been some talk about him moving to second, which is really nice. When you really think about it, it's a pretty obvious move for the Cardinals. You look at who is the most sure players on the team, or the most unsure players on the team, and the surest players on the team are just about everybody except for the middle infield. So Gorman at third base, when you are planning to keep Arenado for long term, is just going to be another Yachty situation. You really just do not want that. So he's shown some growing pains, but happily we recently received a report that he has really cut down the errors in his last 100+ games, and we're looking good. We're looking good as him being a potential second baseman. Now, when that might be, would that be in 2022? There's a hope. It really just depends on what happens with Edman, what happens with DeYoung, and how he looks, because a lot of people are thinking that he is going to be ready at that point. So that would be a huge step if he can come up and he can perform as well, because really then it would just be worrying about the catcher, and then of course worrying about whether or not Paul DeYoung can put it together. But keeping an eye on Nolan Gorman at second base, it's definitely a high-risk, high-reward move for the Cardinals, moving from a corner to a middle. And right now, it seems like the talent is overflowing. It's overriding that difficulty, and it's making it not even a factor at this point. He has gotten over those growing pains really quickly, and it's going to be great to see him. Hopefully next season, I'm very, very hopeful. And that could be not necessarily the key, but that's definitely going to be a big piece moving forward if he really can pan out. Finally, I guess we can just end on a segment about the Foolish Baseball video that came out recently on Yadier Molina. I recommend anyone who is a Cardinal fan to go check it out, because it definitely does a great job dissecting a lot of the issues that come with people's perception and views of Yadier Molina. And yes, there are some numbers and some things that you could put together that really show that or purportedly show that he is not the offensive juggernaut that is needed to be a Hall of Fame player. But at the end of the day, he does a great job of looking at how Yadier Molina intangibly affects pitchers, and how he does things in a way that WAR and other stats have yet to be able to quantify. So, if you're a Cardinal fan, again, I highly recommend it. It's not too hard to find. I believe it's called Yadier Molina is really good, or Yadi Molina is really, or how good is Yadi Molina, something along those lines. But yes, I highly recommend it. Great watch for any Cardinal fan, and will give you plenty of tools to combat those annoying trolls who whine about David Ross and Jason Kendall and all that nonsense. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to this episode. I know I was away last week, but hopefully the little extra talking gave you something to look forward to and to make up for it. So hopefully we will be back with you same time next week. Thank you all so much, and go Cardinals.